Joining us now is Rami Khouri, who is a professor of journalism at the American University of Beirut and also a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's live from Boston. Thank you very much for being with us on Al Jazeera. The Syrian government delegation didn't just blame the opposition for the talks failing, but also the mediator, Staffan de Mistura, who suggested that Russia should get the Assad government to agree to some of the terms and conditions like holding new elections a day before. How much do you think this undermines the UN and de Mistura's position? And where does this leave any hope for future direct talks between the two sides?
I really don't think there's been any major change in the situation. The problem with this situation, this is the 8th round of negotiations in Geneva that have ended in failure. The problem is from the very beginning, any negotiation like this in a war situation that's trying to end the war, end the conflict, that is based on a UN Security Council resolution, as this one is almost always going to get nowhere. And we know that from resolutions 242 and 338 and Israel-Palestine from 1967, and they've gotten nowhere. The problem is that the parties on the ground don't agree. The big powers, Russia, the U.S. mainly outside, who support them, don't agree. They don't have any clear middle ground where they can compromise on right now. But nobody wants to leave the talks unilaterally. So we're still in the same position we were 4 or 5 years ago, unfortunately. That's why you've got all these other talks going on. The Russians have taken the lead now with the Astana talks and the Sochi talks and the national dialogue talks they're planning in a month or two in Russia.
Right.
And so Geneva is still there as a vehicle that everybody can go to once they're actually ready to make a deal.
But Rami, prior to this latest round in Geneva, the belief was that the opposition had somewhat diluted some of their demands, that the Saudi-backed faction within the opposition that had the upper hand had given up on the idea of Bashar al-Assad leaving power. But what we saw instead was the opposition in Geneva presenting a tough public stance, ruling out any future role for Assad in Syria. What does that say about their strength today, and also the role of all these other countries that are involved in the Syria conflict, whether it's Saudi Arabia or the others?
It tells us that the opposition is getting weaker and weaker because their external support from the West and from the Arab Gulf states and others is weakening. And some of the major players, like the Turks, for instance, have no longer say Assad has to leave right now, as they used to say before. So the opposition is divided internally. Their external support is declining.
Right.
They're not unified, and they're not all serious representatives of powers on the ground, though they are serious Syrians who have a lot of legitimacy in their own right. So this has been the problem all along with the opposition groups. The other thing is that these are negotiators.
Right.
What they say is a negotiating position. What they say in public, what they say in private, and they're negotiating all the time. So they'll say something hoping to get a better position the next day, and this goes on and on. And the mediator is a very Staffan de Mistura is a very experienced, serious, and a man of great integrity. But he can't make any headway when the positions are so rigid. And the upper hand is in the hands of the government, in the Assad government right now. And that's one of the reasons why they're getting nowhere, because they don't feel any pressure to make any concessions.
Vladimir Putin has announced the end of Russia's role in Syria, the military operations. But is the conflict about to end anytime soon, Rami Khouri? And can there be a political settlement anytime soon?
There has to be ultimately a political settlement. It's really the only thing that will work. Even when one side defeats the other, there needs to be a political agreement on governing Syria and sharing power among the different groups that have now emerged on the ground. So you have Kurdish groups, and you have pro-government groups, you have some rebel groups who are not Islamists, who have some anchorage in tribal groups and other local groups. And so there has to be a power-sharing agreement with a new constitution. So ultimately, yes, you have to have a political agreement. It may be emerging from a process that the Russians control more than the United Nations right now. And there has to be a mechanism whereby the Russians, for their own sake, can get out of Syria ultimately. They'll always have a base now. They have a big air base, and they have an expanded naval base in Tartus. So their goals have been achieved. They've saved the Assad government. They've got a strong military position for a long time, and they've vastly expanded their impact and leverage all across the region, and probably further away in places like Ukraine. They've got many more diplomatic cards to play. They've got relations with Iran and Turkey that are improved. So they're doing a lot of serious diplomacy, which is strengthening their leverage. Syria, for them, is not as central now as it was 6 or 7 years ago. Therefore, they're probably a little more, the Russians are probably more willing to make some compromises, and they'll nudge the Assad regime towards something that will allow a comprehensive political agreement to happen in the next year or two, presumably, but nobody knows.
Rami Khouri, as always, very good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us on Al Jazeera.